may argue that people with mental disorders are distinct from people with disabilities. The CRPD committee actually addressed this in the context of its concluding observations to Spain in the recent session, where Spain was arguing that, and the CRPD committee said, all people with mental health conditions need to be acknowledged as people with psychosocial disabilities, and I think that's a very important step. So I think we'll give the floor to the panelists in the same order. Ms. Orefellen.
I would like to very shortly address the question Yuri asked. When it comes to emergencies, I think it's important to separate between emergencies and for psychiatry as a response to emergencies. For psychiatry as a response will always be a discriminatory form of coercion. It will always target persons with psychosocial disabilities in some way or another. I think when it comes to emergencies, we need to discuss the real situations and what the proper response will be, but for psychiatry it would never be a possible response.
Thank you, Hege, because I think it gives a background what I was actually also trying to say, which is I think we need to understand how coercion applies also in practice. And in many countries, I would say in most countries, coercion also applies for people deemed unable to consent. And we know that in those cases, the CRPD offers a response, which is decision-making support. But also applies for seclusion and restraints, and I think now the human rights system has a strong consensus that those practices should be eliminated at all, completely. And then of course you have more obvious outrageous cases, including punishment. But then the question comes back always to this situation of, okay, how we deal with emergencies or crisis situations. I think we need to reframe the question, which is not in which exceptional case we apply coercion, but how even in those cases we can support people, because I think sometimes the message is misunderstood. This is not about a very libertarian agenda saying we don't help people, they have the right to die or to kill themselves. And I think it's more about how we provide intensive support with people which experiences a very difficult situation. And the starting point has been always, there are no alternatives. This is the case. And I think practice is showing that there are alternatives, that we can do different things, and from engaging, being available for people, and there are different models that could be applied. The Office of the Special Rapporteur, which I also worked there, on the rights of persons with disabilities, we requested a report to the Melbourne University on alternatives to coercion. And actually, most of the report deals with these cases, crisis situations. And there are practices. Of course, we need more evidence. We need more practice too, but I think we cannot say anymore there is no solution, because there is evidence in place that shows that something could be different. It may be more expensive, it may be more complicated, but it will be rights-based, and I think that's important.
I think we have to look hard at supposedly neutral laws. In Israel, there is a general patients' rights bill that allows forced medical treatment in cases where a patient cannot form an opinion due to a medical or mental situation. Now that is forced treatment in disguise. It's a general law, it looks good, but it could in fact host what we're fighting against. And looking at the emergency situation itself, it's been said, the mental health community, not only the psychiatric, but other professions need to develop a new paradigm, a new treatment paradigm. Now the system is binary. You either have coercion or you have community treatments. In Israel, you can wait weeks to get to a treatment. In between, that is the space to deal with emergency situations. And I would say another thing, that when we have equality discourse, we should rethink penal emergencies in a new light. I mean, people will have, could be accommodations put in the police system, in the punishing system, but it's part of the new discourse. What happens in a penal situation, in a criminal situation, do we go to hospitals, or should the path be in the common legal area of criminal law, where accommodations are put in and special provisions are put in for people with psychosocial disabilities? This is not the politically correct in terms of, in Israel, families are opposing this, but I think something to look at.
Thank you. And I would point out that the example you gave of legislation that allows forced or non-consensual treatment if someone's deemed unable to consent, that violates Article 12. So often we get this kind of shell game where they want a disability-neutral law, but it violates Article 12 because it's depriving people of legal capacity based on a so-called functional assessment, which has been found per se to be discriminatory under the CRPD. I also think that what you were remembering was not exactly about coercion or treatment, it's about the deprivation of liberty, if I remember it correctly. And I couldn't find it, but I think that particular paragraph of a report by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I think that there are different ways that could be understood, and I think that's something worth discussing, but I don't think it necessarily means that they had the position that coercion was legitimate so long as you found some other kind of superficially acceptable language to put it in. And Mr. Schefer, and then we can come back.
I would agree that simply having neutral laws will not solve the problem, because you will just end up with indirect discrimination, and we're addressing the issue here from the point of view of discrimination. With respect to deprivation of liberty, I think we're sailing in quite rough waters at the time. When you look at Western Europe, many countries are introducing new laws allowing deprivation of liberty not as a criminal sanction, but as an administrative measure against terrorism. Now, it might not have, it might look as if it doesn't have a lot to do with our issue, but it does, because it opens up a new avenue to deprive persons' liberty outside of the traditional criminal law area, and that will spill over in our efforts to push back on the deprivation of liberty in this area. The role of psychiatrists, I would merge them, or I would merge this question with the first question about the room for emergencies, or for force in emergencies. It is indispensable that the professional society works toward alternative means, alternative approaches to forced interventions. You will need their professional expertise to do that. And that is why I think it is indispensable to try to convince the professional community to go in the same direction that the CRPD does and the WHO does. Now, to the dialogue with the CRPD committee, of course it is important to have a dialogue, but I would say also by the CRPD committee. This is one small area of dialogue that we can have, but the main dialogues in the end need to take place on the domestic level. It's quite cumbersome. It's nitty-gritty details that need to be addressed, but only then will the political process lead to a consensus that allows us to enact those principles that the CRPD committee and others espouse in the law. Yeah, that's about the issues I wanted to talk about.
Okay, two panelists have a few further comments, Hege.
Yes, I just wanted to comment on the psychiatrist's role, and that is not so easy to talk about. But I think we have to remember that they are not the experts on the rights of persons with disabilities, and on the contrary, as a profession, they have a very long and persistent history of discrimination of persons with psychosocial disabilities, and very grave human rights violations, and at some point that needs to be acknowledged, and also they have to take responsibility for that as a profession. Also for us as victims of these violations to be able to cooperate. And in the future, they will have the role as service providers without the coercive powers of today, and that will be a different situation.
Just a quick remark about the first question. Besides the clause that I said, the medical coercion depends on the ability to form a view, we also have a really general clause in the law, which is very extreme. It allows forced treatment to any person in an emergency, life-threatening situation. Now, other Western countries most often do not have that paternalistic approach, so I'm not necessarily advocating for it, but this is a wide applied clause that has nothing, that is really neutral. It just goes to the medical situation where a person might die on the street if no medical attention is given, and provides medical staff with the ability to give very short, limited medical care. Regarding the second question about the psychiatrist, I think once coercion is taken away, these professionals will have to reinvent their game. They will have to develop and enhance treatment, and they will have to be made attractive to consumers. The hammer hinders development. I spoke about our experience in Israel in trying to abolish restraints. Restraints have been used for 300 years and more. This very primitive tool, I don't know how it could be even quoted as something medical, something each of us can do if they choose to. When this was taken away, the professionals had to develop new strategies to engage with people in acute crisis. Okay? What do you put in place? I think abolishing forced hospitalization and treatment will also develop the right to health and enhance it in a way that we can accept.
Go ahead.
We also need we maybe don't need to, but maybe the psychiatric community need to discuss also what's their role, and that has been an ongoing discussion. I think the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health has put it very clearly, because still many people believe that their role is social control, and that's a reality. And because of that, of course, then that gets legitimized through legislation, and some of them will say, I don't want to act, but the law demands me to do it because liability and other reasons. So how we move from that to psychosocial support, which I suppose that was the main purpose of that, though we know historically it was not. So I think that's a big question, and that probably is a question that goes beyond what I can respond. But I would like to stress that the disability community and the survival movement has tried to engage many times with the mainstream psychiatric community. That has been failure after failure, I would say. And I'm not sure if this is gonna work. But I believe that we can engage with some sectors, some progressive sectors of the psychiatric community that are showing different practices, that are open to have the discussion. Because at some point we also need to bridge between both sectors. And also because younger generations don't deserve to learn what is happening today. People studying medicine in general. So I will keep open that door in terms of engagement, but I think we need to be more strategic as a movement at least on how we engage with them, because otherwise it's very frustrating and it's traumatizing for many people that has already gone through trauma in psychiatry. So I think we need to explore better which are the best entry points in the disability community to engage with them.
Question over here.
Thank you. Okay, I think we'll have, we've got 10 minutes left. I think maybe we'll take the questions and we'll just get through it as much as we can. So first over there, then there's a question there, and you, and I think that's going to be it. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Yvonne. I'm from the Israeli Mental Health Association. Thank you, Sharon, for
Can
presenting.
you use your microphone, please? Do you
It's
see
not
where to push the button?
Now?
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Okay, my name is Yvonne. I'm from Enosh, the Israeli Mental Health Association. So thank you for this panel, and thank you specifically for Sharon for the speech and interesting insights. And we are very supportive of this event, and we think it's interesting how it's connected to what we are going to present tomorrow with the World Health Organization on best practices on mental health, because I think these both sessions need really to talk with each other, and not just the violation of human rights and how we need to change, but also how we can change to a more human rights, community-based services. And that's what we are going to do tomorrow, and I invite us all to really speak about it also tomorrow, to see the other side of services that works and how we can promote the discourse together with professionals, with mental health participants, with people with lived experience, and with governments. So it's a little note, but thank you for this event.
Okay, thank you. And yes, go ahead.
Hello. Thank you so much. My name is Boram. I'm with the Women's Refugee Commission. I was wondering if any of the panelists could speak to the gender dimensions of forced psychiatric treatment. Women and girls with psychosocial disabilities are overrepresented amongst this group, and what might be some strategies and approaches from this perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, well, who would, yeah, please.
Matthew Bowden from People with Disability Australia. My sort of question and comment also goes to the issue of intersectionality and the area for psychiatry. I really think that we need to look at those sort of intersectional issues at play here that lead to sort of hate and bias crimes. And I'd particularly like to raise the issues for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people with disability, where our sexualities and gender identities are stigmatised, our sexualities and gender identities see us being forced into conversion therapies and psychiatric treatment to cure us of our homosexual desires and our trans identities. These treatments, of course, cause significant trauma and harm, and we see people with disabilities, sexuality and gender identities being disproportionately monitored, controlled, and we particularly see this for people with intellectual disability and psychosocial disability. I think that we really need to work together with other human rights activists and allies in the lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender space, so that together we can sort of challenge state-sanctioned discrimination, violence, vilification, and challenge the homophobia, biphobia and transphobia in psychiatry and mental health practitioners that we see really dominant today.
Thank you. Thank you. And I see Martin Buntan, another CRPD committee member, so that's going to be the final question. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I just like to ask this question, sort of like before then, I'd like to give you an update on the progress in my own country. This is Montiel from CRPD committee, but this is more of a country-specific. In Thailand, there's a recent amendment to the Mental Health Act. Of course, it's still far from establishing the supported decision making. It still does not eliminate forced treatment, forced intervention, forced psychiatric intervention, but it seeks to establish so-called the mental hospital committee to tackle the issue of how a person could be treated. And in the legislative body, we were able to at least include a person, a user of psychiatric services as part of the advisory committee to the mental hospital to determine how a person should be treated. And the law itself makes it more difficult to conduct any kind of forced treatment, but still fail to completely ban forced treatment. But we see this as a beginning step toward that in the future. So do you see this as a positive approach to how we can eventually achieve a complete ban on forced treatment, forced intervention of all kinds? Thank you.
Great, thank you for that question. We don't have much time. I don't know if we'll be able to go over a little bit or not, but I'll just throw that open to the panelists. Go ahead.
Just shortly respond to the women from women's refugees. Some of these coercive practices are more used on women, and that has also been recognized in one of the biannual reports of the CRPD committee. Also, some practices can be especially re-traumatizing for women with previous experience of sexual or other violence, like to be put in restraints or being held down, having your clothes removed, being forcibly injected with psychotropic drugs. And various researchers show also that large number of women and girls in psychiatric units have experienced violence or abuse earlier in their lives. And violence against women and women's reactions to such violence often becomes an entry point to coercive psychiatric measures. So it's some intersectionality here that is very interesting to look at.
I just, in regards to forced treatment to the gay community in Israel, interestingly, the breakthrough recently has been done in regard to forced treatment of the gay community. There is a position paper by the Association of Psychiatrists banning this. For us, the gay movement is an inspiration, and it might just pull this discourse to the right direction. I know you were thinking, framing the question differently, but I don't know the Thai law, the new revisions, but as I said previously, I think the era is not for step-by-step amendments. I think we need a total revision. We have to delete everything that's been put in and think new. I think that the little steps which make sense in our lives will actually impede the breakthrough that we need. It's a sort of times even lip service to the CRPD, but it's not the essential change that has to be done. So I think we should be aware of this small changes.
Thank you. Mark?
Just to the comments made by my colleague Monjan Bontan about the procedural issues. And when you look at the European theatre, we had, with the European Convention on Human Rights, we had procedural guarantees introduced toward incarceration and forced psychiatric interventions. Those procedural guarantees lowered the numbers somewhat, but they've been in place now for 30, 40 years in countries, and the result has not been an abolishment of those practices. And also in this regard, when we look at the optional protocol to the Oviedo Convention, that optional protocol tries to support additional procedural guarantees. The CRPD committee, I think, rightly came out against it, out of the realization that procedure in many areas is a very good protector of human rights. But with respect to these very core fundamental issues, procedure in the end doesn't work, doesn't do the trick. So I would, on the level of political pragmatism, one could very well support procedural law statute if you compare it to nothing, but it will not solve the problem.
And Alberto, go ahead.
I want to bring something actually we didn't discuss today, which is the role also of psychiatry and forced practices in the life of drug users. And people with psychosocial disabilities is overrepresented among them. So it's important to keep in mind that in many countries legislation deals differently with those groups and in a more harsher way and longer involuntary commitment. I must confess I'm very frustrated with the adoption of the mental health legislation in Peru, but one thing they got right is they ended involuntary treatment for drug users, and I think that was a pending issue to address in the country. But we tend to not to work with them, and I think we need to build alliances with groups of drug users too, because they're, as the LGBT community, they are also facing the power of social control in psychiatry.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to say just a couple of things to close us out here. I think there's consensus on the panel that we don't want to go with procedural safeguards anymore, that's what has been done in the past. That was actually the pre-CRPD paradigm, was procedural safeguards, and what we created in the CRPD is exactly not that. It's exactly to do something new, to, as Sharon was saying, to really create a whole new vision. And the intersectional issues are very important with LGBT issues, with the rights of women and girls, with the rights of drug users, and we need to make alliances because we see many groups say, don't put us in that mental health basket, don't do mental health coercion against us, and then everybody wants to be taken out, and then who's going to be left? Because you can, even if the explicit authorization to do forced psychiatry to LGBT people based on their sexual orientation or gender identity is removed, you can still be a lesbian, a gay man, a transgender person, and be put into forced psychiatry simply because somebody considers you to be psychotic. So these things that are doing that piecemeal, we also have to be a little bit wary of that and welcome every time the power of psychiatry is curtailed, but we have to address it at its core. So that takes me back to the situation of what we are calling hard cases or emergencies that I think we still have to deal with. And I'm planning to address this question in interventions later in the session, either in the general debate or in relation to Roundtable 2, I'm hoping. I think that the CRPD does give us the answers, and the answers have to start with a new way of thinking. It has to start with the thinking of, as Alberto said, questioning what are we even saying when we say that a mental health crisis is a kind of emergency that the state has to deal with, or that the medical profession has to deal with? What does that even mean? How does that come to be? And can it be otherwise? So that may be a difficult way to end, and I think we do have a lot of optimism. No? Your phone is calling. We do have a lot of optimism in the alliances we're making, in the great work that has been done by the CRPD committee, by other UN mechanisms, by the DPOs of people with psychosocial disabilities, and I think we also need to recognize the continuing leadership role of those who have done it. I want to also allow, my colleague from Dementia Alliance International has told me that they are doing a side event on, what day? On Thursday at 9:45, and that's another intersectional issue where people with dementia are sometimes treated under forced psychiatry and need to not be, and so I think we'll end it there. Thank you all for coming.